Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our audience in the room, and welcome to our audience who joined us online. This is a very exciting seminar for me. I've been waiting for it for 10 years, and it is about crimes, maps, and policing, and how data can improve safety. Because of the broadcast, Chatham House rule do not apply until we close the online feed before the Q&A session. So the presentations will be broadcast, but the Q&A session will not be. So that means only the audience in the room will be privy to the Q&A session. And that means that we will request you under Chatham House rule that you don't quote anyone without their express approval, please. But you are free to do so for the presentations themselves. So, just a little bit of background to the ISS. We're a Pan-Africa Applied Policy Research Institute that also provides technical support and capacity building, and our goal is to enhance security as a means of sustainable peace and prosperity. We work on a whole range of things, from transnational crime to migration, maritime security and development, peacekeeping, peace building, crime prevention and criminal justice, and then of course analysis of conflict and governance. We have over 100 staff members from 16 different African countries, and we are currently working in 29 of those countries. We have offices in South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia and Senegal. And you might be interested to know that we have 60% of our staff is female, and that's even at a managerial level. If you are interested in receiving more information about our work, including publications and invitations to events, please register online on issafrica.org, and you'll receive our weekly newsletter and any of the events and notices of publications that you might be interested in. We just want to also thank our donors, the Hans Seidel Foundation, for making today possible. We really appreciate that. We are also grateful for the support of the members of the ISS Partnership Forum, which includes the European Union and the governments of Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the USA. There are some evaluation forms under your seats, on your seats, next to you, wherever. Please fill those out. We would really appreciate it. And also, please feel free to take hard copies from the publications that you saw outside or downstairs. They are there courtesy of our donors, so please feel free to take one or some or all home with you. Okay, so as I've indicated, I'm super excited about today. It's probably why they couldn't contain me and they forced me to chair or asked me to, because I was just going to jump in and do it in any case. We've seen in the latest crime statistics that 20% of murders happen in only 3% of police precincts. We have seen from previous statistics that about 50% of our 22,000 murders now could occur in about 13% of precincts. And for many years we have looked at data at a precinct level. And that didn't quite help us necessarily, because even in these precincts, violence clusters are small, and there are micro-locations of where crime happen and occur inside of police station precincts. So this presents, and this is, I'm sort of, these are what my colleagues will argue, I think, is that it gives us great opportunities to really target interventions at where it's most needed. And that's why I'm so excited about today, because our speakers will really look at what more localized crime analysis can mean in terms of evidence-based targeted policing. And international research have shown that if you target interventions it can be highly successful. If you just do what you used to do, it can actually cause more damage than good. So it's really important, I think, to start these discussions here today. So on that note, we are launching two of the most exciting publications, I think, to have come out of the ISS, for me at least. And it's these two papers by these two gentlemen on my right. And the first is Dr. Ian Edelstein, an amazing researcher that's been in the field for a long time, that has done incredible work on point data analysis, and also my colleague, Dr. Andrew Fall, that has written this incredibly beautiful, may I say, publication, How to Map Violence Without Police Data. And then, of course, we are very, very grateful to Brigadier Samila next to me for coming at such short notice, because I hear Major General Sekukune was unfortunately called away, and we really appreciate you coming here today and listening and responding and giving your perspectives on this type of thing. Without further ado, because there's a lot to discuss, I would like to hand over to Dr. Edelstein. Ian, thank you.
Okay, good morning everyone, here physically in the room and online. So I'm primarily speaking to a report, which hopefully some of you here in person have picked up. For those online, it is available free for download on the ISS website. This examines point-level crime data in Khayelitsha. And in essence, I'm asking the question, though I don't think I'm able to answer it, can we find and can we cool crime hotspots in a high crime area? So, as was already mentioned by Lizette, we know in general there have been increasing trends in violent crime. They have risen. Murders are up by 3.4% year on year in the latest data. Other crimes have risen as well. But we know the crimes are not evenly dispersed across the country. Certain stations chronically appear as having the highest crime levels. And up until now, we don't know beyond that at a more granular level where crime is actually occurring. Because even within the station levels, as I will show, crime is not evenly dispersed. There are hotspots, so it appears. But this depends upon both access to the data and the accuracy of that data. So I'll primarily look at crimes across Khayelitsha, hotspots and anomalies. If time permits, I want to go into a little bit of looking at hotspots in Inyanga, and then possibly talk about prospects for intervention and research. But I need to be careful of time because we've got other speakers and need plenty of time for Q&A. So looking at the trends year on year, this is for Greater Khayelitsha. This is comprised of Khayelitsha Police Precinct, Harare Police Precinct, and Lingala West. So all three accounting for a population of nearly 500,000 people with quite high levels of crime. What we see, the three stacked on the top. If I go this way, it's not going to show up well. These are combined robberies. We see an increasing trend from roughly 2010 to 2011. And then these are murders on the bottom. What I want to point out here is that just in the last year, so we knew overall for the country there was a 3.4% increase in murders, but for Greater Khayelitsha, they saw an increase of 20% in murders year on year. And this also is in an area where the Khayelitsha Commission of Inquiry deliberated for more than a year, heard testimony, gave recommendations to try and improve policing and the community police interface. So we see a general trend where, at least for robbers, murders, violent crimes appear to be on the increase in this area. So looking at the first map, this is for 2006 to 2016. Actually, I think we've trimmed it to the calendar years, 2007 to 2015. This is showing all crimes across Greater Khayelitsha, the green being for Khayelitsha Police Precinct, red for Lingaletu West, and blue for Harare. A few things I want to point out at this level. We see quite a dense concentration across the Khayelitsha, the green Khayelitsha Police Precinct, less dense for Lingaletu West and Harare, with what appear to be some open spaces, particularly down in Harare where we see built environment, dwelling areas, even informal settlement areas. I know it's hard to see at this level of resolution. Sorry. But what appear to be no crimes at all, and this is across a 10-year period. So right away some questions about where crimes are located, why we see one police station that's almost completely filled in, and others where there are gaps. Additionally, we see this pocket here in between Khayelitsha Police Precinct where there are Lingaletu West crimes reported. So this may speak to a jurisdictional issue. This is Mew Way heading north-south, where perhaps Lingaletu West has this corridor, responsibility for this corridor, but it would seem challenging to respond to crimes in the middle of Khayelitsha Police Precinct for Lingaletu West. Okay, this is the next map. Basically, all murders over this period have been binned into 267-meter square blocks, along with putting a legend showing some of the built environment features, where some of the possibly some of the crimes could be explained in terms of the built environment. And what I want to point out here is that we see a general tendency for some clusters of murders. This is right around Khayelitsha Police Precinct. We see a medical facility immediately to the south. Up here is one of the hottest areas. We'll look at that in more detail soon. Also down here in Harare, centered on another medical facility. That's the Khayelitsha Day Hospital. And then again near shopping center, transit station. Okay, and that's for murders over the 10-year period. Now looking at robbery incidences, what I think is striking here is that we see some very high robbery blocks surrounded by cooler, low robbery blocks. Tendency here as well. Still seeing some high robbery blocks around medical facilities, next to the police station, etc. So one of the potential explanations for what appear to be concentrations of murder and robberies at or adjacent to the medical facilities could be that victims are presenting at these facilities, and that's where the crimes are being located for lack of having more detailed information on the case and where it occurred. But we also see the possibility that crimes are being tagged or located at the police station. I should also probably clarify that, so this data, this is point level crime data, all crimes by category that occurred in these three Khayelitsha police stations over this 10-year period. Basically what I've been able to access through a public access to information request is a very simple spreadsheet of the crime category, the date and time code for the crime, and then the GPS coordinates, latitude and longitude, and that's it. I don't know anything further about the nature of the crime. So every incident has that information recorded, and it appears, from what I can discern, that there is a requirement that there have to be geo-coordinates input for every crime incident, whether they are correct, whether they're known, or whether they are incorrect or not verified. Now we go another step further to look at actual hotspots, clusters. This is a fuzzy mode analysis showing all points with 10 or more incidences within a 50-meter radius. And I've broken this out into two different time periods because there are some rather significant changes. What I want to point out here is that we see both some residential clustering at what appear to be intersections, sometimes intersections adjacent to informal settlement areas, in a neighborhood in close proximity to both the school, and these are on fringes of informal settlement areas, on two ends of a medical facility, an intersection, a roundabout, another, yeah, that's the roundabout, and then also extending onto the outskirts of Khayelitsha in what appears to be a corridor without any residential facilities, and a very dense concentration around a medical facility and shopping center, one of the densest. Right? So these appear to be very dense concentrations of crimes, often at intersections with medical facilities or schools, perhaps explaining the crimes themselves, or that they're serving as landmarks for where crimes are being located. That's 2007 to 2009. When we jump to 2010 to 2015, very different patterns starts emerging. And I should point out that most of these concentrations are still found in the Khayelitsha police station precinct. As we saw, it's much denser in terms of the crime levels, even down to this sort of point level concentration. More of it is centered in Khayelitsha police station, with several in Lingaletu West as well. But what's critical to note here is that we start seeing what appears to be this grid patterning of the data. The data are appearing along perfect lines of latitude and longitude with respect to each other. And when we look closer at that, we find that the points are spaced precisely the same distance apart in both latitudinal and longitudinal directions. So this kind of pattern appears totally unnatural, especially if you see it's extending even into an undeveloped green space, extending across streets, going in not diagonally across streets in perfect lines. So there's something happening with the data and how they're being spaced and referenced. And I would still be curious to hear from SAPS if there is an explanation for what could be happening here. We see this happening both in the Khayelitsha police station data during this 2010 to 2015 time period, but also in Lingaletu West in these two hotspots. One is centered right over the police station, another along Mu Way, going across from a residential area into an undeveloped area. And then this method is hierarchical spatial clustering. This can help to try and identify somewhat more dispersed hotspots and group them together. So this is counting a minimum of 200 incidences within 200 meters of each other. And what I want to point out here, there's a tendency for these hotspots to roughly follow. This is the Metro Rail corridor, which splits Khayelitsha east to west. That they seem to be following the corridor, especially through Khayelitsha. We've even got a hotspot centered on one of the train stations. One incorporates towards the north of the Khayelitsha police station, one the shopping center medical facility to the south. But they all seem to be on the north or the east of the railway line. And what we can't quite see at this level of resolution is that some of these hotspots appear both at major intersections and or in proximity, though not centered over, in proximity to informal settlement areas. So again, it's possible that some of these landmarks, the intersections, the shopping centers may be serving as reference points to georeference crimes when the accurate locations, precise locations are not known or not captured. And then we see down in Harare, somewhat more dispersion going into the neighborhoods away from the main corridors. Now I want to look closer at this grid pattern data. So in essence, we don't see it in the 2007 to 2009 period. This is, where is the police station? I'm not finding, oh, there it is. Yeah, maybe difficult to see. This is the police station down here. So we've got one set of gridding appearing in this area to the north, to the east of the police station. This is the other that extends across into the green belt. And here you've even got, for instance, house robberies going into this undeveloped green space. So clearly some issues with how crimes are being tagged. And again, I don't have an explanation. My only guess is that if the crime, the software that the police use to record the crimes requires that geo-coordinates are input, they may be using some kind of starting point, for instance, a residential area next to the police station rather than the police station itself. And then the program is automatically dispersing the crimes over an area. And similar patterns developing in that 2010 to 2015 period. This is looking at Lingaletu West, the police station area, and then this residential section extending across Mew Way into the undeveloped area. Okay, and what I want to point out here, and hopefully Andrew will also touch more around evidence-based policing, but if we want to try and pinpoint where crimes are happening, when crimes are happening, address them and measure whether or not there's an impact of intervention, be it from police, be it from civil society, from NGOs, from other government sectors, we would really need accurate data that give both the location, precise location, and the precise time to see what's happening with respect to the hotspots and with respect to the surrounding areas if there would be some kind of displacement effect. And with this kind of data, it would be virtually impossible to say for sure that something is happening in terms of both a growing crime phenomenon and a crime reduction effect based upon interventions. Now we look closer at several hotspots. So this one is in Site B, Khayelitsha. This is Ikusi Primary School, and this is a site actually where I did much of my field work for my PhD, so I'm familiar with the area. So we see two clusters that appear to be centered along intersections. This is Tandazo Drive, in more formal housing areas. But if you can see, these are large, well, I should say dense informal settlement areas, both to the north and to the south of the primary school, where there's relatively little crime that has been geolocated. So what I would surmise is that these intersections are serving as the reference point for crimes that may be occurring across the informal settlement area and even surrounding communities as well. We also see very few crimes on the school grounds, but sometimes even house robberies. This is in pink, geolocated, referenced on the school grounds, even some on the railroad line as well. So some issues with the location of the data. My point here is that this is how we could identify hotspots, how we could try and see what's happening over time in those hotspots, but only if the spatial data are accurate for that to occur. And one second hotspot that we'll look at, this is in Harare. This is adjacent to Sinako High School. Again, we see two clusters. This is more formal residential area. You can see the clean grid lines of the streets, so it's not purely informal, but still densification in terms of backyard settlements, backyard shacks. And these two built up crime hotspots that roughly appear to be within the residential areas, close to the high school, but not actually on the perimeter or the grounds of the high school. So one might initially suspect that the high school could be generating crime, but with this kind of location, several blocks away from the high school, it's difficult to say what could be accounting for those concentrations of crimes. We don't see the same grid patterning of the data, but we do see rather odd clustering, again, intersections that could be used as reference points for the broader community. This is in the Makaza area of Harare Police Precinct. How are we for time?
You have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, excellent. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead a few slides, but I want to move over to Inyanga Police Precinct and bring in a bit of a time element. So I'm going to jump through these. I think this is interesting because we're looking at murders and robberies by hour of the day and day of the week for Inyanga. And I think this has come through both from the SAP's presentations with the latest data release, as well as others, that there is a tendency for, oops, sorry, this thing is jumpy, for crimes to be concentrated over weekends. So we see a real buildup. This is for murders, roughly from 7 o'clock on Saturdays going into the evening hours. Well, I should say even into Friday night, into the evening hours, wee hours of Saturday, Saturday nights, into Sunday, Sunday nights again, and maybe tapering into Monday mornings. That's for the murders. However, for robberies, the most concentrated hours appear to be 5 to 6 a.m., all days of the week, and then another concentration around 7 to 9 in the evening, more towards the weekends. But this strongly suggests robberies that could be related to early morning commuting hours. So here's the same thing for Inyanga. I'm not going to go into detail here because I want to move on to some of the hotspots. But what I want to show you, you see definite concentration here. But this is what I want to point out. These are the actual boundaries of the Inyanga census level main place. So the Inyanga police precinct extends well beyond the Inyanga main place into parts of Browns Farm, Philippi, into Crossroads, into Samora Machel. And so many of the hotspots at this level are actually not within Inyanga. They're within other parts, other communities, but that fall within the Inyanga police precinct. So this speaks again to this issue of whether or not we're looking at station level versus more precise data to try and determine where hotspots occur. We hear year in, year out, Inyanga is referred to as the murder capital of the country. But in fact, one could say perhaps murder is actually happening within Browns Farm, Philippi, within Samora Machel, more than it is within Inyanga. Aggravated robberies. Sorry for jumping around here. So we looked at Durbanville. One thing I want to point out here, more than half the crimes in Durbanville police precinct are happening up in the northeast corner, far away from the Durbanville Central Business District, adjacent to the Fasantacral train station and township. Fasantacral itself is part of the Crayfontaine police precinct, and that's one of the notorious high crime police precincts. But we see, as I said, more than half of the murders and robberies from Durbanville occurring adjacent to the Fasantacral township. And this may again speak to some jurisdictional issues where crimes may be occurring in this kind of no man's land, presumably separated by the railroad line between the township and the paths that people may be using to get to and from the train station. So this is the overall hotspot visualizations for Inyanga, and what we've done, this is the second report that we are working on, but it's still not published yet. So we've tried to identify both murder hotspots, but also several corridor hotspots that follow roadways to, again, try and explore in more detail how the built environment could be having an influence. So I want to look at just two hotspots, then I'll wrap up. So this is one, the densest hotspot that we identified in Inyanga. This area would be equivalent to a circle only 56 meters in diameter, yet it's seen 71 murders in this 12-year time frame. So it's accounting for 2.2% of all murders in Inyanga, plus 60 aggravated robberies. So something like this would be a very focused, hot point for violent criminal activity, talking about it's probably centered over maybe only 5 or 6 dwelling areas. This is in Samora Machel, and one would hope that police are aware of this hotspot, that they have taken some action, but we definitely see a tendency for crimes, both murders in red and the aggravated robberies, to have increased substantially since 2014, 2015. So it appears to be both a very concentrated hotspot, but one that is growing in terms of its levels of crime. And this is where one would hope that the police were able to take action. But in particular, access to this data would allow communities, community policing fora, to try and understand where crimes are occurring, where and when crimes are occurring in their communities, and also be able to engage with the SAPs to understand what they're doing to try and interrupt those crime patterns. This one, much more dispersed across, this is Crossroads if I'm not mistaken, but I want to move on in the interest of time. This one is centered over the Inyanga taxi rank, and what I want to point out here is, to me, this looks like a more realistic hotspot for crime in terms of the locations, the patterns of the crimes within the taxi rank, following the street corridors, with some concentrations at some of the intersections near a high school as well. quite dispersed in terms of hours of the day, even days of the week, with murders concentrated more on the weekend hours, and some fluctuations in terms of the level over time. So here's one of the street corridors that we've identified as a robbery hotspot. This is an N2 exit, so coming into Inyanga. A very short stretch. Don't have the distance here, but you're talking only a 0.02 kilometer square area, accounted for 7 murders, but 99 aggravated robberies, 1.6% of all of Inyanga. And what it looks like, if cars are coming off the highway, potentially as they're slowing down at the intersection, again, if the locations are precise, it looks like they may be the victim of smash and grab, hit and run kind of robberies. And here you've got this dense informal settlement area that follows the frontage area along the N2. And this could be possibly an area where a small number of criminals from nearby areas are using this as their stomping grounds. And perhaps better lighting, better passive surveillance in terms of CCT cameras could help to cool this hotspot. And then the last that I want to point out, here's another stretch, a longer roadway. This is a stretch along New East Lebanon Road, bordering Crossroads to the east and Inyanga proper to the west. What's interesting here in terms of the built environment is this road has a parkway or boardwalk lined with trees along the western edge, and then road front dwellings or businesses along the eastern border. And this is one of the few parkways that I've found in this part of Cape Flats, where it appears that, by environmental design, the intent was to create a more pedestrian-friendly corridor, but we see what appears to be a very concentrated area of crime along the roadway. Some crimes appearing on both the residential or business side, and the other along the walkway or park side of the roadway. So again, this could suggest an area where random patrols, where passive and active surveillance could help to change the crime patterns. And with that, I think I will wrap up and hand over to my colleagues. So thank you.
Thank you, Ian. That was fascinating. That's why I didn't shout it and say stop like 10 minutes ago. Thank you very, very much. Andrew, please, you're up next with your fascinating policy brief.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Andrew Fall, a senior researcher here at the ISS. My presentation is a little bit, starts with a cynical flair. Ian has presented the promise and potential of access to accurate crime data. Notwithstanding the potential flaws that we've seen, I think it's clear that we can, with the right tools and data, illustrate how crime and violence clusters together in particular places. But as we all know, we live in a country where that data isn't easy to come by. So the cynical flavor is, how do we map violence without police data? This is the second report which is being launched today, and it's predominantly written for provincial governments and city governments, but there are aspects that are relevant to communities as well. Anybody who might be interested in trying to map violence in order to guide their interventions if they can't access SAPS data. So why is it important to map violence? One reason, as Ian has shown, is violence is clustered in particular places. We're also entering a phase in human evolution where we understand more about the risk factors, the predictors of violence, and the interventions that successfully work to address violence than ever before. So we're increasingly seeing groups such as the College of Policing in the UK reviewing all the most rigorous studies on what works and what doesn't to address violence, and compiling lists of promising interventions, what doesn't work. So we've got the tools, or we're increasingly gaining new insight into what tools are likely to have an impact. But if we don't know where to implement those tools, it doesn't help us. The emergence of this evidence-based violence prevention and evidence-based policing field has also made clear, as Ian's presentation showed, that a lot of violence is clustered in time and space. It's perpetrated by a small number of people who repeatedly offend, and it's often associated with predictable behavior. So again, looking at the recent crime statistics, we see big 50 to 70% of murders occurring over weekends. There's lots of alcohol consumed over weekends. Alcohol is often consumed in particular places. You can quite quickly narrow down where one's resources should be focused by looking at the data. South Africa also has a policy environment that recognizes the importance of data and suggests that everybody should have access to it to guide their violence prevention interventions. So the White Paper on Policing says that communities have a right to regular and comprehensive and timely information from police. Information is a little bit ambiguous. I suppose the SAPS can say that doesn't say crime data. But it seems the White Paper is saying we recognize that in order to have partnerships with communities, with businesses, with provincial and city governments, we need to share our data with them. The White Paper recognizes that. Similarly, the White Paper on Safety and Security, which has a more holistic vision of safety provision and violence prevention, recognizes that data is critical to guiding interventions, and that any intervention that is carried out needs to be monitored, evaluated to determine its impact. This is the basic model of evidence-based policing and evidence-based violence prevention. It's where we have an idea, we have an hypothesis, we test it, we monitor and evaluate it, we learn our lessons, we add those lessons to the evidence base, and we continue to learn. If we have access to data, if we implement interventions systematically, we should exponentially become more effective in addressing crime and violence. So the evidence-based policing literature shows that the types of policing strategies that are most likely to be effective are those that are proactive, so not waiting for a call to service necessarily, but rather saying there are micro-locations that cause lots of harms, so we will proactively engage in those spaces. Targeting specific places and times, targeting specific problems, trying to understand what it is about that 50 square meter circumference that is causing or allowing for robbery and murder. Consistently fair and professional, so none of this rah-rah shoot to kill, but rather treating everybody, including offenders and victims, with respect and courtesy, and of course being guided by and evaluated through accurate data. Of course, all of this is an evolving field. The best evidence is only the best evidence for now. We will continue to learn as we go, and most of the best evidence, or what is considered the best evidence, has been generated in other countries. So we have a great opportunity to test whether these types of interventions work here. In terms of the South African Police Service, the SAPS requires that its crime intelligence officers at station level do map crime. We've seen some of that data. It's not clear, as we've seen from Ian's presentation, that this data is always accurate. And we know that most of us don't have access to this data in the way that we would need to have access if we were going to use it to keep ourselves safe. So if I live close to a 50 square meter circumference that's generating a lot of murder and aggravated robbery, of course I would know that I'm at risk because I live in the community, but if I had access to empirical data, I could use it to mobilize out the resources, hold the police accountable, and other interventions. So, assuming that on the one hand, we're all constantly working with the SAPS to have better and more regular access to this data, but assuming we can't access it, what are our alternatives for understanding where violence is most likely to happen, so that a provincial government, a city government, a community, a business group can try to intervene? We know that murder is our best indicator of violence. For every dead body that turns up, there will be 100 bodies that are injured but not killed. So one of the most effective ways to map violence is to look at murder or to look at public health data. Some of you, I think a year ago, I presented this same image here, the Cardiff model of policing, which recognizes that when we look at, if one collects anonymized data in trauma facilities, trauma rooms in health facilities. So I come in with an injury and you don't take my name, but you say, what kind of injury is this and where did it occur? One can quite accurately map where violence is happening. So this map on the left, these red points show where violence is occurring in London based on health data. So we ask questions in health facilities and we find these hotspots. The map on the right is police data. So you can see that the red squares on the police map are almost empty. The police data doesn't reveal the hospital data. The police, and this is the UK where they presumably have more efficient systems in some regards, they are totally missing the violence hotspots, which are apparent to health facilities. So one way that a provincial government here that has access to provincial health data could map violence, particularly in areas where violence is most pronounced, is to look at the Khayelitsha hospitals and do simple surveys there to try to identify where violence is occurring. Of course, it's resource intensive, it's not simple. We need to try to save people's lives before collecting information, but it is possible, and there have been some tests of this method in South Africa. Another good source of data is mortuary van data. Again, provincial authorities have access to provincial mortuary statistics. Mortuary vans can record where they collect bodies, but even if we didn't want to do that, we could simply look at the trackers within mortuary vans excuse me, and see where they stop when they get called out, and estimate violence from that data. It wouldn't be perfect, but none of this is about getting things perfect. This is about, if we can't access perfect data, what are the best ways in which authorities can get a sense of where violence is occurring. I'm pleased to report that the Western Cape is now regularly releasing and trying to map their mortuary data, I think perhaps in response to this report. So we'll see what happens with that. One of the most promising ways that we can map data is that at the station level, substations often do share crime data with communities, particularly community policing forums where they are established and where relationships are good. This doesn't happen everywhere, but because violence and serious crime are often very focused in particular stations, if we simply identified, for example, in the Western Cape, 10 police stations record 50% of murder, 10 out of 150 stations. So simply trying to map through community policing forums violence in those 10 stations would be a good start and would provide a good tool. There are also various CPFs that don't have relationships with police, like the Mitchell's Plain Community Policing Forum in Cape Town, but who have their own mapping systems. So they are trying to map crime and violence in their area without the SAPs, again, because everybody's trying to figure out as best they can where things are happening. There are also other types of groups that map crime. This map over here is from Obswatch. It's a community group not formally affiliated with the SAPs in Observatory in Cape Town. It's generated a user generating map. Excuse me. So anybody in the community who experiences a crime excuse me, can send basic information and it gets mapped. Of course, that isn't perfect, it isn't complete, but we would see the same in SAPS data. 29% of robberies last year, I think, were reported to the SAPS based on victim survey data. So if 29% of robberies are being reported in OBS, then this is potentially as effective or as accurate as SAPS data. Communities can be aided by the technological revolution, of course. There are very exciting apps and software packages emerging. This is called Lockstat. It's produced by Suritech Geospatial in Cape Town, former special forces intelligence people in Cape Town who've started a private company. They offer this package free of charge to communities who want to use it to map crime in their areas. I'm sure it's part of a bigger business plan where they end up making profit, but the potential is that a community buys into this, everybody has it on their app. Anytime you experience a crime, you can log it exactly where it occurred. You can also integrate this with your private security providers in the area and with the SAPs, so that private security vehicles are visible on a map. You can see them on a live feed. You can see your SAPS vehicles on a live feed. You can see your neighborhood watch patrollers on a live feed. And all of those can be coordinated based on the analysis of crime incidents that the software produces. Great in theory, difficult to implement. It requires lots of buy-in and coordination. Finally, just some examples from the city of Cape Town of what the city has tried to do to get a sense of where its violence hotspots are. It has program EPIC. It's trying to be a smart city, capture data in lots of interesting ways. One of the things it does is it reviews EMS call-out data, ambulance data for all drug-related, gunshot-related, assault and domestic violence-related ambulance calls every month. So where are ambulances being called to for these types of incidents? That gives a good sense of where things might be happening. Looking at origins of calls for service. So if I'm calling for an assault, where's that phone call coming from? Not perfect data, but it gives a good indication. And then ShotSpotter, the acoustic gunshot technology that the city uses. This is an example of calls for service to Cape Town Central Police Station. It's about 9 years old, but I just put it here to give a sense of how mapping calls for service can provide a lot of insight that even accurate crime data wouldn't provide, because there were 75 calls for assault, 68 for assault GBH. A lot of these won't end up in a crime docket, a crime being formally opened. There may well be violence, there may well have been a scuffle, but it doesn't end up as a formal record on a book. So mapping these types of calls would give you additional insight into hot points where violence is likely to occur without relying solely on your victims to report crime. And finally, ShotSpotter is the acoustic gunshot technology that the City of Cape Town uses in a couple of areas. It has amazing potential, but being the province and the city, they can't compel SAPs to respond to gunshot technology. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it can identify the caliber of weapon, how many shots were fired, and it can geolocate the point of firing to within a few meters. So lots of potential, but very expensive, and it's unclear whether it's had any impact reducing violence. In fact, it probably hasn't, because we've seen increases in murder in almost all high crime areas in Cape Town. And lastly, I think this one is the least helpful, but is worth including anyway. This is community mapping, bringing people together as a community and saying, okay, if we don't have any other access to crime mapping, let's put a map of our area up on the wall and talk about space and think about space and where do we feel unsafe and who has experienced what where. And then that produces a tool that can potentially be used for conversations with police and other providers for addressing risk factors. So just in summary, we know that crime and violence are clustered in space, time. Often a lot of it is committed by the same offenders. We know that for policing and violence prevention to be effective, it should target these types of places. Policing and other violence interventions can't be everywhere, they can't address everything, but we know that so much harm happens in so few areas that if we could cut those by 50%, we would significantly improve safety in the country at large. We have a country where policy provides for access to data. Policy requires that the whole of government evaluates carefully what it's doing to see whether it's working and feeds that into an evidence base, but it's unclear whether that's happening. It's unclear what the quality of the SAPS data is at the moment. And from my perspective, and what I suggest at the end of the report, is that concerned provincial governments, the simplest way would be to set up a system where they weekly reach out to CPFs, and for instance, the 3 Khayelitsha stations contact CPF chairs and ask them, where did murder occur over this weekend, or where did murder occur over the past week? That would give you quite accurate data. A province or a city could then map that. Again, it's not perfect, but it should be enough to empower other political players to intervene where possible. Of course, the ongoing challenge is that the province, the city don't have the authority to guide the SAPs, but there's plenty more that they can do. There are various ways that we can map crime and violence. The City of Cape Town has got very impressive systems in place, but they're limited by not having access to SAPS data. The SAPS has impressive systems, but there are some concerns about quality. And as we saw from the Cardiff model, it's likely that the SAPS is unaware of a whole lot of data that could be generated in health facilities in terms of where violence is happening. And that's about it. I end by saying that the missing nugget is mortuary van data, but as I say, the Western Cape has now started to refer to mortuary data as its best measure of what's happening in the province, particularly since the SANDF has been deployed. And I think there's plenty of potential for other provinces to try to empower citizens and empower themselves by more systematically trying to understand where harm is occurring and using that to guide interventions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew. You've provided us with a lot of food for thought. Now, Brigadier, you are welcome to sit here or go onto the podium. It's your choice, but yes, it would be interesting to hear the perspective of the Crime Registrar's Office on all this mapping and so forth. So, please.
Okay. Now I'll sit here. I don't have a presentation. I was only informed yesterday that I must come here. And as crime registrar within the South African Police Service, we are the custodian of crime statistics. So I'm just going to give you the structure of crime registrar and also what are the responsibilities of crime registrar as a component. We are a component within the South African Police Service, and it's a national component. We report directly to the National Commissioner. In other departments, it's called Chief Directorate, but in the police, it is called a component. So we report directly to the National Commissioner, and the provincial heads of crime registrar, they report to the national head of crime registrar. But they provide crime analysis support service to the provincial management. So they report to the national head, but they service the provincial management. And also at station level, the structure at station level is called CIMAC, and it stands for Crime Information Management and Analysis Center. So that office at station level, they report to the provincial head, but they service station management. So they provide information to station, crime information to station management. What is the purpose of this structure? Crime registrar. Our purpose is to ensure that reliable and validated crime information is provided to the operational units or environments within the service through controlled and scientific practices. That is what we do. We provide information to the operational, crime information to operational units within the service. At national level, there are 3 sections. In other departments, they call them directorates. The first one is policy, standards, and compliance. And that section is responsible to develop standards, policies, and standard operating procedures. The section is also responsible for compliance. Those approved standards, we must make sure that they are adhered to by our members in the environment. The second section is quality assurance and help desk. And that section is responsible for the information on the system to make sure that the crime data or crime information in the system is correct and complete. The last section is crime statistics and research. And they are responsible for 2 things: to provide the crime picture. This is the crime picture, and also they explain that crime picture that they've provided. At station level, where we are called SIMAC, we have 3 key focus areas or performance areas to make sure that the information is correct and complete, quality assurance, to provide crime picture to station management, and to explain that crime picture. I want to say something about the quality of our information. This year, the Statistician General certified our statistics as official statistics, meaning they met all the quality dimensions according to the Statistician General. So the Statistician General says you can trust our figures. I will stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Brigadier. I understand. And yes, and as I said, it's always difficult to respond, after you've only heard like less than 24 hours ago that you are coming, to such dense presentations by our colleagues here. But I think your value cannot be overstated in terms of just, in terms of Q&A and just these partnerships and dealing with analysis and trying to start unpacking what the values are, how we can work together from a national to a local level in terms of unpacking the challenges but also the opportunities that we face in dealing with data and what types of data is required, not only to predict and have policing interventions, but as Andrew has pointed out so eloquently, that we can deal with, or we can take this data and really start developing evidence-based violence prevention policies or strategies and plans that don't necessarily just rest on the shoulders of the police, but actually as a collaborative, multi-stakeholder types of initiatives that I think this country needs. We have strategies and plans every year, and every year we see specific violent crime categories, the ones that we fear the most, increase year on year, from murder to robberies. And these are the crimes that not only shake the confidence of South Africans in all localities, but also what we've seen economically and internationally. The question we keep on getting after the release of the crime statistics, so wonderfully done by your office, by the way, is the fact that why are we so violent? And what will work to reduce the violence? And we've been having the same conversation for so many years. I think it is very useful to start changing the narratives and changing how we can all work together to really make a meaningful impact. So thank you very much for availing yourself at such a short notice. Now I need to also thank our online audience for their presence and for listening to these fascinating 3 presentations. But we have to say goodbye now, and then we'll open the floor for some questions and comments.